You know, folks, I've been watching what's unfolding very carefully over the past 72 hours, and I have to tell you, there are moments in American foreign policy when the distance between what we're told and what's actually happening becomes so wide that you can't ignore it anymore. We're in one of those moments right now. The headlines say that Saudi Arabia just walked away from the oil production agreement that was supposed to stabilize global energy markets. But here's what most people don't realize. This isn't just about oil prices or diplomatic embarrassment. This is about what happens when you treat strategic partnerships like personal favors, when you conduct foreign policy through social media threats instead of patient diplomacy, and when the gap between presidential rhetoric and geopolitical reality becomes so enormous that even our closest partners can't pretend anymore. The Saudis didn't just walk away from an agreement. They walked away from the illusion that this administration understands how power actually works in the 21st century. And the consequences of that decision are going to hit American families harder than most people understand right now. Let me give you the facts as they stand this morning. Saudi Arabia announced that it would no longer coordinate oil production cuts with the United States, effectively dissolving the framework that had been holding crude prices in a manageable range since early 2024. Within hours of that announcement, Brent crude jumped 11%, crossing $97 a barrel for the first time in 8 months. West Texas Intermediate followed, hitting $93. Gas futures spiked 14% in a single trading session. By tomorrow morning, analysts at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan are projecting that pump prices across America will climb somewhere between 35 and 50 cents per gallon within the next 2 weeks. That's not speculation, that's market reality responding to the collapse of an arrangement that took years to build and apparently took one phone call to destroy. Bloomberg reported this morning that the breaking point came during what they described as a heated exchange between the president and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, where the president allegedly threatened to withdraw American military support from Saudi Arabia if they didn't increase production immediately to drive down prices before the midterm elections. According to 3 separate sources who spoke to Reuters, the Crown Prince's response was to effectively say, "Fine, let's see how that works out for both of us." Now, I want to be very clear about something. Saudi Arabia is not a democracy. Mohammed bin Salman is not someone I would choose as a partner if we had unlimited options in the Middle East. When I was president, I had my share of difficult conversations with Saudi leadership about human rights, about regional stability, about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. But here's what I understood then and what apparently got forgotten somewhere along the way. You don't have to like your strategic partners to recognize that the relationship serves American interests. And you absolutely cannot treat a relationship that's been built over 75 years like it's a real estate negotiation where you walk away from the table if you don't get exactly what you want in the moment you want it. The U.S.-Saudi relationship exists because we need things from each other. We need energy market stability and a Sunni counterweight to Iranian influence in the Gulf. They need security guarantees and access to American weapon systems and intelligence. It's transactional, it's complicated, and it requires what diplomats call strategic patience. What it does not survive is public threats, personal insults, and the kind of short-term thinking that sacrifices long-term stability for a temporary political win. We've got to remember how we got here because this didn't happen overnight. When I was in office, we worked with the Saudis, with other OPEC members, with major consuming nations through forums like the International Energy Agency to manage supply disruptions and prevent the kind of price shocks that devastate working families and trigger recessions. It wasn't perfect. Markets are never perfect. But there was a structure, there were relationships, there were people in rooms who could pick up a phone and have a conversation that didn't immediately leak to the press or turn into a Twitter war. After September 11th, that relationship got more complicated. President Bush had to navigate supporting Saudi Arabia while also holding them accountable for the ideology that had radicalized 15 of the 19 hijackers. President Obama had difficult moments with them over the Iran nuclear deal, which they opposed, but through all of that, both administrations understood that you manage these tensions privately, you build coalitions quietly, and you never, ever make it personal with a crown prince who controls a quarter of the world's proven oil reserves. Here's what really concerns me, and we'll come back to this in a moment because it tells you everything about what went wrong. In 2021 and 2022, when oil prices were spiking because of the pandemic recovery and then because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this administration needed the Saudis to increase production to bring prices down. They did. Not as much as we wanted, not as fast as we wanted, but they moved. They understood that stable prices served their interests too, because if oil gets too expensive, it accelerates the transition to renewables and electric vehicles, which is existentially threatening to an economy that's 90% dependent on petroleum exports. So there was alignment, there was cooperation, and then according to multiple reports from the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, sometime in mid-2024, the president started making public statements suggesting that the Saudis owed us, that they needed to pump more oil, not because it served mutual interest, but because he demanded it, because he wanted lower gas prices heading into an election. And when they hesitated, when they said that flooding the market would crash prices below their fiscal break-even point and destabilize their entire economy, the response was threats, public threats, threats to withdraw military support, threats to block arms sales. Threats delivered on social media where the whole world could see a superpower trying to bully a partner instead of persuading them. Now look at what happened to Congress in all of this. The Constitution is pretty clear about the fact that American foreign policy is supposed to involve more than one person making decisions based on whatever he feels like tweeting at 6 in the morning. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, these bodies exist to provide oversight, to ask hard questions, to make sure that when we're making commitments or threats to other countries, somebody's thinking through the second order and third order consequences. But where were they when this relationship was falling apart? According to reporting from Politico, senior members of both parties knew that the U.S. with Saudi relationship was deteriorating. They knew that the president's approach was burning bridges with a partner we've relied on for 3/4 of a century. And they did nothing. No hearings, no public statements, no attempt to restore some kind of institutional check on a foreign policy that's being conducted like a reality television show. I'll be the first to say that Congress has been largely passive on foreign policy for decades now, both parties. The abdication of the War Powers Act started long before this administration. But there's a difference between Congress deferring to presidential leadership on complex diplomatic negotiations and Congress just checking out entirely while the president systematically destroys relationships that millions of American jobs depend on. We're way past the first category now. We're deep into the second. Then there's our alliances more broadly, and this is where things start to get complicated in ways that are going to hurt us for years. The European Union released a statement this morning expressing concern about energy market volatility. That's diplomatic language. What it actually means is that they're terrified because Europe gets significant portions of its oil from the same Gulf producers, and if the Saudis are walking away from production coordination with the United States, what does that mean for their supply security? Germany's economy minister said, and I'm quoting directly, "We cannot rely on American leadership to stabilize global energy markets when that leadership is conducted through ultimatums rather than partnerships." That's a NATO ally. That's the largest economy in Europe saying out loud that they don't trust American foreign policy anymore. And frankly, can you blame them? If you're sitting in Berlin or Paris or London right now, What you're seeing is an American president who treats diplomacy like a business negotiation where you threaten to walk away if you don't get 100% of what you demand. That might work when you're buying real estate in Manhattan. It categorically does not work when you're trying to manage complex relationships with sovereign nations that have their own interests, their own domestic politics, and their own breaking points. Japan issued a statement through its foreign ministry noting that it's watching the situation with concern. Japan imports 90% of its oil from the Middle East. South Korea, same situation. These are treaty allies who depend on us not just for military protection, but for the kind of steady, predictable foreign policy that allows them to plan their energy security and their economic futures. And what are they learning right now? They're learning that American commitments aren't worth the paper they're printed on if they depend on relationships that can be destroyed overnight because the president got mad during a phone call. The Council on Foreign Relations published an analysis this afternoon arguing that what we're witnessing is the collapse of the post-1945 American-led international order. Not because that order was perfect, but because this administration has systematically dismantled the trust and credibility that made it function. When your adversaries question your judgment, that's one thing. When your allies start openly saying they can't rely on you anymore, that's a fundamentally different category of problem. Let me tell you something about the evidence here, because I want people to understand that this isn't partisan interpretation. This is documented fact. The Wall Street Journal reported on Thursday, citing 4 separate Saudi officials, that the final conversation between the president and the crown prince included a direct threat to remove American troops from Saudi territory and to suspend all pending arms sales unless the Saudis immediately increased production by 2 million barrels per day. Now, 2 million barrels per day would have represented roughly a 40% increase in Saudi output above their current production levels. Any economist will tell you that kind of surge isn't physically possible in the short term, even if the Saudis wanted to do it. The infrastructure doesn't exist. The spare capacity isn't there. So what we're talking about is a demand that couldn't be met, followed by threats when it predictably wasn't met, followed by the complete breakdown of a relationship that has anchored American energy security and Middle East policy since Franklin Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz on the USS Quincy in 1945. Reuters obtained and published excerpts from internal State Department communications showing that career diplomats warned in writing that the president's approach was going to backfire, and these are their words. Publicly threatening a strategic partner with military and security consequences over energy policy disagreements will likely result in the partner calling our bluff and forcing us to either back down or follow through on threats that damage our own strategic interests. That was written 6 weeks ago. It was ignored, and now here we are, exactly where they said we'd be. The Saudi ambassador to the United States reportedly told the Secretary of State in a private meeting last month that continued public pressure and threats were making it politically impossible for the Crown Prince to be seen as capitulating to American demands. In Saudi domestic politics, giving in to American pressure after public threats would make Mohammed bin Salman look weak. And for a leader who's consolidated power partially by projecting strength and independence from the United States, that's not an acceptable outcome. So the choice from their perspective became cooperate quietly and look like an American puppet, or refuse and look like a strong leader defending Saudi sovereignty. The president's tactics guaranteed they'd choose the second option. Oxford Economics released a forecast this morning projecting that if oil prices settle in the $95 to $110 per barrel range, which is where most analysts think we're heading, the impact on global GDP will be a reduction of approximately 0.8% in 2025. That translates to slower growth, higher inflation, and in some economies, outright recession. For the United States specifically, they're projecting that sustained oil prices above $95 will add roughly 1 percentage point to core inflation, which means the Federal Reserve is going to keep interest rates higher for longer, which means mortgage rates stay elevated, which means the housing market stays frozen, which means construction jobs don't come back, which means the entire economic recovery that's been building gets significantly more fragile. And all of that flows directly from a diplomatic failure that was both predictable and preventable. The International Energy Agency issued a statement noting that global strategic petroleum reserves are already at historically low levels after the releases in 2022 and 2023 in response to the Ukraine crisis. The United States has released over 250 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the past 2 years. We've refilled some of that, but we're still roughly 150 million barrels below where we were in 2021. That's a cushion that doesn't exist anymore. So when prices spike because of supply disruptions or because a key producer walks away from coordination agreements, we don't have the same tools we used to have to stabilize the market. The reserve exists for genuine emergencies, for wars and hurricanes and supply shocks that nobody could predict. It doesn't exist to compensate for diplomatic malpractice. Now, I need people to hear this. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that the Saudis are blameless. They're not. Mohammed bin Salman has made decisions that I find morally reprehensible. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi was an outrage. The humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen happened partially because of Saudi military intervention. The treatment of women and dissidents and religious minorities in Saudi Arabia violates every principle that America is supposed to stand for. When I was president, I raised these issues directly. President Obama raised them. President Biden raised them. But here's the honest truth. You can pressure partners on human rights while maintaining the strategic relationship, or you can blow up the strategic relationship and lose all leverage on human rights. What you cannot do is somehow pretend that publicly humiliating them and threatening their core security interests is going to make them more likely to listen to American concerns about anything. The leverage we had came from the relationship. The relationship just got destroyed. So now we have higher oil prices, weaker alliances, less ability to influence Saudi behavior on human rights, and a Middle East where American credibility is in free fall. Explain to me how that makes America stronger or safer or more prosperous. All right, let's talk about who actually pays the price for this disaster, because it's not the people who made the decisions. The single mother in Detroit who's trying to get to her shift at the hospital just watched her commute cost jump by $15 a week. That's $60 a month. That's $720 a year. For someone making $35,000 a year, that's 2% of their entire income gone because somebody in Washington couldn't figure out how to have a productive conversation with an ally we've been working with since 1945. The truck driver running routes through Appalachia just saw his fuel costs spike by double-digit percentages. Small trucking companies operate on margins so thin that a sustained increase in diesel prices can be the difference between staying in business and shutting down. And when trucking companies fail, the cost of transporting everything from food to furniture goes up, which means everybody pays more at every store for every product. The farmer in Kansas who's getting ready to plant next season just learned that fertilizer costs are going up again because fertilizer production depends on natural gas, and natural gas prices track with oil prices, and when oil spikes, everything spikes. So the cost of growing corn and soybeans and wheat goes up, which gets passed on to food processors, which gets passed on to grocery stores, which gets passed on to families who are already struggling with food costs that have climbed 25% over the past 3 years. The retiree in Florida, living on a fixed income, just watched the purchasing power of that fixed income decline because inflation is about to get worse instead of better. Social Security adjustments don't happen in real time. They happen annually based on lagging data. So when prices spike in the middle of the year, people on fixed incomes just absorb the loss until the next adjustment catches up, if it catches up. And then there's the global impact that most Americans don't see directly, but that matters enormously. The family in Mumbai who can't afford cooking fuel because global energy prices spiked. The factory worker in Bangladesh who just lost their job because the textile plant they worked for couldn't absorb the increased cost of electricity and transportation. The small business owner in Kenya who can't get goods to market because fuel costs made it economically impossible. These are people who had nothing to do with American foreign policy decisions, who don't get to vote in American elections, who don't benefit from American prosperity, but who pay the price when American leadership fails. And I'll be the first to say that we can't solve every problem in the world. We can't make decisions based solely on how they affect people in other countries. But we also can't pretend that there's no moral weight to the fact that American policy decisions have enormous consequences for hundreds of millions of people who have no voice in those decisions and no recourse when those decisions go badly. Here's what worries me most about where this could go. I see three possible paths from here, and I want to be very clear about what each one looks like. The first possibility, the optimistic scenario, is that cooler heads prevail. The president realizes that he overplayed his hand. The Saudis realize that they need the American security relationship more than they need to make a point. Both sides quietly walk this back over the next few weeks. Production coordination gets restored, prices stabilize, markets calm down. I'd put the probability of that scenario at maybe 20%, and even if it happens, the damage to the relationship is real and lasting. Allies around the world just watch the United States try to bully a partner and fail. That doesn't get forgotten. Trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild if it can be rebuilt at all. The second scenario, and the one I think is most likely, is prolonged crisis. The Saudis don't walk back their decision because they can't afford to look weak after taking such a public stand. Oil prices stay elevated. Maybe they settle in the $90 to $105 range instead of spiking to $120, but that's still high enough to do significant economic damage. Inflation stays sticky. The Federal Reserve can't cut rates as much as they'd like because price pressures aren't coming down. Economic growth slows. Consumer confidence drops. Small businesses that were barely hanging on during the pandemic and the inflation spike finally give up. Unemployment doesn't spike dramatically, but it ticks up, and the people who lose their jobs are disproportionately in industries that can't absorb higher energy costs. Meanwhile, American credibility in the Middle East continues to erode. Other partners start wondering if they're next. The UAE starts diversifying its security relationships. Qatar starts having more conversations with China about energy deals. Turkey, which was never a reliable ally to begin with, moves further into its own sphere. And slowly, painfully, the American-led order that has provided relative stability in the most volatile region on Earth for 75 years starts coming apart. Not because of a single catastrophic event, but because of the accumulated weight of broken trust and failed leadership. The third path, and the one that keeps me up at night, is catastrophic escalation. Oil prices don't stabilize, they spike. Maybe Iran decides this is a perfect moment to make a move in the Gulf, knowing that American-Saudi coordination is broken and American credibility is shot. Maybe there's an incident in the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe a tanker gets attacked. Maybe something happens that under normal circumstances we could manage through our relationships and our alliances. But right now, those relationships are broken and those alliances are fraying. And suddenly we're not talking about expensive gas. We're talking about a genuine supply crisis where oil crosses $130, $150 a barrel. We're talking about rationing. We're talking about a global recession that makes 2008 look mild. We're talking about the kind of instability that leads to conflicts we can't control and outcomes we can't predict. I'm not saying that's likely. I'm saying it's possible. And the fact that it's possible, the fact that we're even having to consider scenarios like that because of completely avoidable diplomatic failures should terrify every American who understands how fragile global stability actually is. So what do? What can ordinary citizens do when they're watching this unfold and feeling powerless? Here's what I'd say. First, we've survived oil shocks before. We survived the 1973 embargo. We survived the Iranian Revolution. We survived the Gulf War. America has corrected course after strategic mistakes. We've rebuilt damaged relationships. We've learned from failures. This is bad, but it's not irreversible. Second, demand accountability from your elected representatives. Congress has a constitutional responsibility to provide oversight on foreign policy. If they're not doing that, if they're letting one person make decisions that affect gas prices and grocery bills and whether your retirement savings maintain their value, then they're not doing their jobs. Call them, email them, show up at town halls, make it clear that foreign policy is not some abstract thing that only matters to elites in Washington. It matters to every family trying to make ends meet. Third, refuse to accept the idea that this is just how things work now, that alliances don't matter, that expertise doesn't matter, that institutions don't matter, that we can just make it up as we go along and everything will somehow work out. That's not how the world works. That's never been how the world works. Power without strategy is just chaos. Strength without wisdom is just destruction. We've got to remember that leadership is not the same thing as making threats. Leadership is building coalitions, finding common ground, understanding that other countries have interests too, and figuring out how to align those interests with ours in ways that serve everybody. That's hard. It's slower than sending an angry tweet. It requires patience and humility and the ability to think past the next news cycle. But it's the only thing that actually works over time. This is still our country. We've still got a say in how it's governed and how it engages with the world. Elections matter. The choices we make about who leads us matter. The standards we hold our leaders to matter. And right now, those standards need to include a basic understanding that you can't conduct foreign policy through personal grievance and expect it to end well. The world is too complex. The stakes are too high. The consequences of failure hit too many people who can't afford to pay for somebody else's mistakes. I've seen moments in American history where it felt like the ground was shifting, where it felt like we were losing our way. And we found it again. We can find it again now. But it's going to require us to demand better, to expect more, to refuse to accept that incompetence and recklessness are just the price of doing business. This matters. It matters to your family's budget. It matters to your job security. It matters to whether America remains a country that other nations trust and respect and want to work with. We can get this right. I still believe that. I have to believe that. But we're running out of time to prove it.